There's a specific kind of heartbreak that Carl Jung discovered isn't really heartbreak at all. It's something far more profound, far more dangerous, and it only happens to a very specific type of person. If you've ever loved someone you couldn't be with and that love felt different from anything you'd experienced before, if it carried a weight that didn't make sense, a recognition that transcended logic, then what I'm about to share will completely reframe everything you've believed about why that person appeared in your life and why you still can't let them go. Jung spent decades documenting a pattern he initially called the curse of differentiated perception, and what he found shattered every conventional understanding of impossible love. He discovered that people who fall deeply for unavailable partners aren't unlucky in love. They possess what he termed psychological X-ray vision, the ability to see through social masks, to perceive soul qualities that others completely miss, to recognize depths in people that even those people don't recognize in themselves. And here's what Jung found most disturbing about this pattern. The very same mechanism that allows you to see so clearly is the exact mechanism that draws you toward people you cannot have. This isn't coincidence. This isn't bad timing. This is your consciousness operating at frequencies that most people will never access. And it comes with a specific psychological price that Jung believed only 8% of the population ever pays. You see what others don't see. You feel what others don't feel. You recognize connections that others can't perceive. And because of this rare ability, you become magnetized to people who are unavailable precisely because they're the only ones complex enough, deep enough, real enough to match the level at which you naturally perceive human beings. Jung made a startling discovery in his clinical practice. He found that his patients who experienced the most profound, impossible love stories were the same patients who could walk into a room and immediately sense every hidden emotion, every unspoken tension, every carefully maintained facade. They could read micro-expressions in milliseconds. They could feel other people's pain before those people consciously acknowledged it themselves. They could predict relationship outcomes with eerie accuracy, not through logic but through what Jung called unconscious pattern recognition. These weren't separate abilities. They were different expressions of the same rare psychological function. But here's where Jung's research becomes deeply personal. He realized that this pattern wasn't just something he observed in his patients. It was something he lived himself. During his most painful period, his impossible connection with a patient he couldn't be with, Jung discovered that his own capacity for seeing everything, for perceiving what others missed, had drawn him into a recognition so profound that conventional relationship categories couldn't contain it. His impossible love wasn't destroying him because he was weak. It was overwhelming him because he was seeing at levels most people never access. If you've ever felt like you're living in a different reality from everyone around you, if you've loved someone impossible and wondered why you couldn't just move on like normal people do, share in the comments just one word that describes what you saw in that person that no one else seemed to see. Because Jung believed that acknowledging what you perceive is the first step toward understanding why your heart operates at depths most people will never explore. Jung's breakthrough came during what he called his most dangerous clinical case, a patient he documented in his private journals in 1914, just after his devastating break with Freud. This patient was a woman he described as possessing undifferentiated intuitive perception, someone who could sense psychological realities that remained invisible to everyone else. She came to him not because she was mentally ill, but because she was drowning in her own clarity. She could see through every social performance, detect every hidden motive, feel every suppressed emotion in the people around her, and this ability had made her life unbearable. But what fascinated Jung most wasn't her perceptive ability itself. It was the pattern of her romantic history. Every person she'd ever loved deeply had been unavailable, married, emotionally distant, geographically impossible, psychologically unavailable. At first, Jung assumed this was self-sabotage, some unconscious fear of intimacy playing out through partner selection. But as he worked with her, he discovered something that would change his entire understanding of both perception and impossible love. She wasn't choosing unavailable people despite her clarity. She was drawn to them because of it. Jung realized that people with highly differentiated perception don't experience attraction the way most people do. They don't fall for surface qualities, for social status, for conventional attractiveness, or even for availability. They fall for what he called soul signatures, essential qualities that exist beneath personality, beneath behavior, beneath all the layers that most people use to evaluate romantic potential. And these soul signatures are rarest in people who are psychologically complex, emotionally deep, spiritually awakened. The exact qualities that often make people unavailable for conventional relationship. He wrote in his private notes, "The patient loves not the man himself, but what she perceives as his essential nature, his undeveloped potential, his hidden depths that even he cannot consciously access. She is attracted to the soul she sees, not the life circumstances he inhabits." This creates an impossible situation because she cannot have a relationship with someone's essence when their conscious personality remains unavailable. Jung observed that his patient could describe this unavailable man with startling psychological accuracy. She knew his childhood wounds without him sharing them. She understood his defense mechanisms before he displayed them. She recognized his spiritual yearning before he acknowledged it himself. This wasn't projection or fantasy. Jung verified her observations, and they proved remarkably precise. She was genuinely seeing aspects of this person that he kept hidden from everyone, including himself. And this created what Jung called the perception paradox. The deeper she saw into his essential nature, the more impossible the relationship became, because what she was recognizing and loving existed at levels he hadn't consciously integrated yet. She was in love with his potential self, his authentic self, his soul self. But his conscious personality, his daily life, his actual availability existed in completely different psychological territory. She was loving someone who existed, but who wasn't yet fully present even to himself. Jung realized this wasn't unique to this patient. This was a pattern he was seeing repeatedly in people with superior perception. They fell in love with what they could see that others couldn't, and that very clarity made the love impossible. Jung began documenting what he called the 4 perceptive types among people who experience impossible love. He discovered that not everyone with differentiated perception sees in the same way, and understanding your specific type reveals why certain unavailable people magnetize you while others don't affect you at all. These weren't personality categories. They were descriptions of how your unconscious mind processes the invisible psychological information that others completely miss. The first type Jung identified was what he called the emotional empath. These individuals don't just observe other people's feelings, they absorb them directly into their own nervous system. When they encounter someone carrying deep emotional complexity, especially someone who suppresses or hides their feelings behind carefully maintained facades, the empath system recognizes that hidden emotional landscape immediately. They're drawn to unavailable people who are suppressing the most intense emotions because their perceptive system is specifically calibrated to detect what's being hidden rather than what's being shown. Jung observed that emotional empaths often fall for people who appear emotionally controlled, distant, or unavailable, precisely because underneath that control lies an ocean of unfelt feeling that the empath can sense. They're not attracted to the unavailability itself. They're attracted to the emotional depth that the unavailability is protecting. The person seems mysterious, fascinating, profound, but what they're really perceiving is suppressed emotional complexity that no one else detects. The second type was what Jung termed the pattern prophet. These individuals possess unconscious ability to perceive psychological trajectories, to see where someone's current patterns will inevitably lead them. When they meet someone unavailable, they don't just see who that person is now. They see who that person is becoming, the psychological potential waiting to unfold. They fall in love with the future self they can perceive forming in the present moment. Jung wrote, "The pattern prophet loves the person's evolutionary direction, their psychological destiny, their soul's intended development. But this future self hasn't manifested yet in the person's conscious life, creating the cruel situation where they're in love with someone who exists, but hasn't arrived yet." The third type Jung called the wound recognizer. These individuals have done extensive psychological work on their own trauma and shadow, and this inner work has given them the ability to recognize similar wounds in others, even when those wounds are completely hidden. They're magnetically drawn to unavailable people who carry unhealed trauma that matches their own healed wounds. They see the person's pain, recognize its shape, understand its origins, and feel an overwhelming pull to help that person heal the way they've healed themselves. Jung observed that wound recognizers often describe their impossible love as feeling like coming home, like finally meeting someone who understands them. But what they're actually experiencing is recognition of their own past suffering reflected in another person's present struggle. They're drawn to the unavailability because the psychological wounds causing that unavailability are precisely the wounds they've learned to heal in themselves. The fourth and rarest type Jung documented was what he called the soul witness. These individuals possess what Jung termed archetypal perception, the ability to see beyond personality entirely into what he believed was the eternal essence of another person. Soul witnesses don't fall in love with someone's personality, their life circumstances, their behavior, or even their potential. They fall in love with what Jung called the self, the deepest, most authentic essence of who that person truly is beneath all psychological layers. And this creates the most painful form of impossible love because what they're recognizing and loving exists in a dimension where practical relationship categories become completely irrelevant. Jung documented that soul witnesses often describe their impossible love as feeling timeless or beyond this world. They report experiences of recognition so profound, it feels like they have known this person forever, across lifetimes, in dimensions beyond ordinary reality. Jung didn't dismiss these reports as fantasy. He believed they represented genuine perception of what he called archetypal connection, soul recognition that transcends the personal unconscious and touches the collective unconscious where all souls share common ground. But here's what made this type most dangerous in Jung's observation. Soul witnesses often cannot move on from their impossible love because what they perceived was real. They genuinely saw and connected with the other person's essential nature in ways that person may never consciously experience with anyone else. The recognition was authentic. The connection was profound. The love was based on truth, not projection. And yet, the relationship remains impossible because seeing someone's soul doesn't guarantee compatibility with their personality, their life circumstances, or their conscious choices. Jung wrote in his private journals, "The soul witness experiences the most profound connection and the most complete impossibility simultaneously. They have touched something eternal in another person, while that person's temporal life remains completely unavailable. This creates psychological suffering that conventional therapy cannot address because it attempts to heal something that isn't pathological. The soul witness isn't broken. They're simply seeing at levels where ordinary relationship rules don't apply. Understanding which perceptive type you embody reveals why certain unavailable people affect you so deeply, while others don't touch you at all. You're not randomly attracted to unavailable partners. Your specific form of differentiated perception is recognizing specific qualities that most people miss entirely. The emotional empath sees hidden feelings. The pattern prophet sees emerging potential. The wound recognizer sees familiar pain. The soul witness sees essential nature. Each type sees truth that others cannot perceive. But Jung discovered something crucial that transforms this understanding from mere psychological theory into practical wisdom. He found that each perceptive type attracted impossible love for a specific reason, and that reason revealed exactly what psychological work that person needed to do. Your impossible love wasn't random. It was precisely calibrated to activate the specific growth your soul was ready to undergo. Take a moment and ask yourself honestly, what did you see in that person you couldn't have that no one else seemed to recognize? Was it their hidden emotional depth, their unrealized potential, their unhealed wounds, their essential soul nature? Understanding what you saw reveals why you saw it and what it's meant to awaken in you. If you're beginning to recognize your perceptive type, share in the comments which type resonates most deeply. Sometimes naming what we've been experiencing in silence is the first step toward integrating what we've been carrying alone. Jung made his most disturbing discovery about impossible love and differentiated perception when he realized they didn't just coexist in the same people, they were causally connected. Superior perception doesn't just happen to attract you to unavailable partners, it actually creates the conditions that make the love impossible. And this revelation changed everything Jung understood about why certain souls suffer this specific pattern, while others never encounter it at all. Here's what Jung observed in his clinical work. When someone with highly differentiated perception meets someone they recognize at soul levels, something happens in the unconscious of both people that Jung called premature soul exposure. The person with superior perception sees so deeply, so quickly, so accurately, that they inadvertently bypass all the normal psychological defenses, social protocols, and gradual revealing that allows most relationships to develop naturally over time. They see the other person's essence immediately, and something in their energy, their presence, their way of being communicates that recognition. The other person feels seen in ways they've never experienced, perhaps in ways they're not ready to be seen. And this creates what Jung termed recognition terror, an unconscious panic response that manifests as unavailability, distance, withdrawal, or circumstances that make relationship impossible. Jung wrote, "When one soul sees another too clearly too quickly, the seen soul experiences this as both profound gift and existential threat. The gift is being truly witnessed. The threat is being unable to hide. Most humans are not psychologically prepared for such complete recognition, and their unconscious mind creates barriers to protect them from the vulnerability that such seeing demands." This explained a pattern Jung had observed repeatedly. His patients with superior perception didn't just happen to choose people who were already unavailable. They often reported that the person seemed available initially, that connection felt mutual and possible, but as the depth of recognition became apparent, the other person began creating distance, manufacturing obstacles, becoming suddenly unavailable in ways that made no logical sense. Jung realized the superior perceiver's clarity was actually triggering the impossibility. Their ability to see so deeply was activating defense mechanisms in the other person that manifested as unavailability. The recognition itself was creating the circumstances that made the relationship impossible. Not because the other person didn't feel the connection, but precisely because they felt it too intensely, too completely, too soon. But Jung discovered something even more psychologically complex. The superior perceiver's unconscious mind was often collaborating in creating this impossibility. Part of them wanted the profound recognition without the demands of sustainable relationship. Part of them craved the intensity of seeing and being seen at soul levels without the requirement to integrate that recognition into daily partnership. The impossibility protected them from having to discover whether the recognition could survive ordinary life. Jung called this the intensity preservation instinct. The unconscious mind of the superior perceiver sometimes orchestrated impossible love, because possible love would require them to maintain that level of depth within the context of mortgage payments, household chores, bad moods, and all the unglamorous realities that test whether soul recognition can become sustainable partnership. The impossibility kept the recognition pure, intense, untested by mundane reality. Jung documented what he called the sacred function of impossible love in the psychological development of people with differentiated perception. He discovered that these experiences weren't romantic failures or evidence of poor partner selection. They were initiations into understanding love itself as something far more complex than conventional relationship categories could contain. Every impossible love was teaching the superior perceiver something essential about their own consciousness that they couldn't learn any other way. For the emotional empath, impossible love taught them to distinguish between their own feelings and feelings they were absorbing from others. By falling for someone whose emotional complexity they could feel but couldn't fix, they were forced to develop what Jung called empathic sovereignty, the ability to perceive others' emotions without taking responsibility for healing them. The impossibility was teaching them that seeing someone's pain doesn't obligate them to suffer that pain themselves. For the pattern prophet, impossible love taught them the difference between perceiving potential and expecting that potential to manifest. By loving someone's future self that hadn't arrived yet, they learned that seeing where someone is heading doesn't mean they'll actually get there, and doesn't mean you should wait for them to arrive. The impossibility was teaching them that recognizing possibility doesn't make that possibility inevitable. For the wound recognizer, impossible love taught them that healed wounds in themselves don't give them power to heal those same wounds in others. By being drawn to someone whose unhealed trauma matched their healed trauma, they discovered that healing is ultimately individual work that cannot be accomplished through relationship, no matter how profound the recognition. The impossibility was teaching them that seeing someone's wounds doesn't make them responsible for binding those wounds. For the soul witness, impossible love taught them that recognizing someone's essence doesn't create obligation for that essence to manifest in relationship form. By connecting at archetypal levels with someone whose temporal life remained unavailable, they learned that the most profound recognition can be complete in itself, without requiring conventional relationship structure. The impossibility was teaching them that soul connection transcends and often contradicts practical partnership. Jung observed that people who understood these lessons transformed their impossible love from wound into wisdom. They stopped believing their superior perception was a curse that doomed them to perpetual heartbreak. They started recognizing it as a gift that required conscious development, careful boundaries, and mature understanding of what different types of connection actually mean. But Jung warned about the shadow side of this understanding. Some people with differentiated perception use these insights to justify avoiding available love entirely. They convinced themselves that their perceptive abilities made them too evolved for ordinary relationship, that their capacity for depth meant they could only love impossible people, that their soul recognition abilities exempted them from doing the work of building sustainable partnership with someone actually available. Jung called this spiritual bypassing through superior perception, using your gift as an excuse to avoid the vulnerability that available love demands. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, if you're wondering whether your impossible loves have been teaching you something essential or protecting you from something necessary, share honestly in the comments whether you've used your perceptive abilities as armor against available connection. Sometimes admitting our defensive patterns is what finally allows us to transform them. Jung discovered that the path from impossible love to integrated wisdom required what he called the reconciliation of opposites, learning to hold your superior perception while remaining open to available connection, maintaining your capacity for depth while accepting that sustainable love often develops gradually, rather than through instant soul recognition. This wasn't about lowering your standards or settling for less. It was about understanding that different types of love serve different functions in psychological development. He observed that people with differentiated perception often confused intensity with authenticity. Because their impossible loves felt so profound, so recognizing, so soul-deep, they unconsciously concluded that any available love that didn't match that intensity must be shallow, inauthentic, or inadequate. But Jung discovered this was a fundamental misunderstanding of how different types of connection function psychologically. Impossible love, Jung found, operates in what he called archetypal space, the realm of pure potential, essential recognition, and symbolic meaning. It's love freed from the constraints of daily reality, untested by ordinary challenges, protected by impossibility from ever having to prove itself through sustained partnership. This creates intensity, but Jung questioned whether intensity alone indicates depth, or whether it might sometimes indicate the opposite, connection that remains perpetually potential because it never faces the tests that reveal whether soul recognition can mature into soul partnership. Available love, Jung observed, operates in what he called incarnated space, the realm where soul recognition must prove itself through daily choices, where depth must sustain itself through ordinary moments, where profound connection must integrate itself into actual life rather than remaining in the protected space of perpetual potential. This requires different capacities than impossible love demands. It requires patience, compromise, acceptance of imperfection, willingness to be seen in your unglamorous humanity, capacity to love someone's ordinariness as much as their extraordinariness. Jung wrote, "The superior perceiver often believes available partners lack depth because they don't trigger the same intensity as impossible love. But they fail to recognize that the absence of intensity might indicate presence of groundedness, that the lack of immediate soul recognition might allow space for gradual revealing that proves more sustainable than instant knowing, that the person who doesn't overwhelm them might be the person with whom they could actually build, rather than just feel." He documented cases where his patients with differentiated perception Once they understood these distinctions, began approaching available connections differently. They stopped expecting immediate soul recognition as prerequisite for giving someone a chance. They allowed relationships to develop gradually, giving their perceptive abilities time to appreciate qualities that don't announce themselves through instant intensity. They practiced what Jung called conscious ordinariness, the discipline of staying present with someone through unglamorous moments, rather than only showing up for profound connection. And Jung observed something remarkable. Many of his patients discovered that some available people possessed depths that revealed themselves slowly, authenticity that showed itself through consistency rather than intensity, soul qualities that emerged over time rather than declaring themselves immediately. These people didn't trigger the instant recognition that impossible loves did, but they offered something the impossible loves never could: the possibility of discovering whether soul recognition could mature into soul partnership. Jung called this the movement from potential to incarnation, learning to value actualized connection as much as recognized potential, appreciating what exists over time as much as what appears in intense moments, choosing what can be built together over what can only be felt separately. Jung made a profound observation about people who successfully integrated their superior perception with their capacity for available love. He found they underwent what he called perceptive maturation, a psychological development where their gift of seeing deeply remained intact, but became more discerning, more boundaried, more conscious about when to engage their full perceptive capacity and when to allow connection to develop naturally without immediately seeing everything. He observed that immature use of superior perception meant seeing everything about everyone immediately, absorbing all available psychological information without discrimination, recognizing soul depths in every person they encountered, and becoming overwhelmed by the constant flood of information their perceptive system was processing. This created what Jung termed promiscuous perception, seeing deeply without purpose, recognizing profoundly without integration, connecting intensely without building. Mature use of superior perception, Jung discovered, meant choosing consciously when to fully engage their perceptive abilities and when to allow surface interaction to remain surface interaction. It meant recognizing that not every person needs to be seen completely. Not every encounter needs to become soul recognition. Not every connection needs to be tested for maximum depth. It meant developing what he called perceptive discernment, the wisdom to know which people and which situations warrant full engagement of their gift. Jung found that people who developed perceptive maturation naturally became less attracted to impossible love, not because they lowered their standards or suppressed their abilities, but because they stopped using those abilities indiscriminately. They learned to reserve their full perceptive capacity for people who were both capable of being seen at those depths and available to explore whether recognition could become relationship. But Jung identified something crucial about this maturation process. It required grief. His patients had to mourn the loss of intensity addiction, the intoxication of instant soul recognition, the drama of impossible love, the identity of being someone whose perceptive gifts made them too deep for ordinary relationship. They had to grieve their attachment to suffering as evidence of profundity, to impossibility as proof of authenticity, to intensity as measurement of meaning. Jung wrote, "The superior perceiver must undergo a death of their romantic self-concept. They must release the unconscious belief that their suffering makes them special, that their impossible loves prove their depth, that their perpetual heartbreak demonstrates their capacity for profound connection. This death feels like losing themselves because they've unconsciously built their identity around their pain. This grief process wasn't quick or easy. Jung observed it could take years for someone to fully release their attachment to impossible love patterns. But he found that those who completed this psychological death and rebirth emerged with something rare: the capacity to see deeply without needing intensity, to recognize profoundly without requiring impossibility, to connect authentically while building sustainably. These individuals, Jung observed, often ended up creating partnerships that combined soul recognition with daily partnership, depth perception with practical building, profound connection with ordinary life. They didn't sacrifice their perceptive abilities. They learned to integrate them into available relationship rather than only accessing them in impossible circumstances. Jung called these individuals conscious lovers, people who brought full awareness to both their gifts and their patterns, who used their superior perception in service of building rather than just feeling, who chose incarnated love without abandoning their capacity for archetypal recognition. Jung's final insight about impossible love and differentiated perception came late in his life, recorded in his private journals just years before his death. He wrote that people who experience this pattern are carrying what he called evolutionary consciousness, awareness that precedes collective readiness, perceptive capacity that prepares humanity for psychological developments that haven't fully arrived yet. Your impossible loves weren't personal failures. They were initiations into understanding forms of connection that human consciousness is slowly learning to integrate. He observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception appeared before collective consciousness could fully appreciate or accommodate their gifts. They lived as what Jung termed consciousness pioneers, people whose psychological development exceeded their culture's capacity to recognize, support, or integrate what they were experiencing. Their impossible loves weren't just personal heartbreak. They were evidence of souls perceiving possibilities for human connection that society hadn't developed structures to contain yet. Jung believed that in future generations, as collective consciousness evolves, the kinds of recognition that now manifest as impossible love will become integrated into new relationship forms. Soul recognition won't have to remain separate from practical partnership. Archetypal connection won't have to exist only in protected spaces of impossibility. Depth perception won't have to choose between intensity and availability. But for now, people like you are living in the gap between what consciousness can perceive and what culture can accommodate. This doesn't make your suffering less real. It makes it meaningful. You're not broken from loving impossibly. You're ahead of your time. Your perceptive abilities, your capacity for soul recognition, your impossible loves, they're all evidence that your consciousness operates at frequencies that collective development hasn't caught up with yet. And that's not a curse. That's your contribution to consciousness evolution. But Jung emphasized that this evolutionary role doesn't exempt you from doing your individual work. You still need to integrate your perceptive abilities, develop healthy boundaries, grieve your impossible loves, and remain open to available connection. Being ahead of collective consciousness doesn't mean you should stay isolated in your advanced awareness. It means you need to learn to bridge between the depths where you naturally operate and the surfaces where most people live, bringing your gifts into incarnated form rather than keeping them protected in archetypal space. Your impossible love taught you to see. Now your work is learning to see wisely. It showed you depth. Now your task is learning to find depth in available forms. It gave you soul recognition. Now your challenge is discovering whether that recognition can mature into soul partnership with someone who can actually choose you back. You were never meant to suffer impossible love forever. You were meant to learn from it what only impossible love could teach, and then bring those lessons into creating possible love with someone ready to meet you at the depths your impossible love taught you to inhabit. If this exploration has helped you understand your impossible love as initiation rather than failure, as gift rather than curse, as preparation rather than punishment, I'd be deeply honored to hear what you've learned about yourself through loving someone you couldn't have. Share in the comments what your impossible love taught you about your own perceptive abilities, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to understand their own experience as meaningful, rather than just painful. If you found value in this journey through Jung's understanding of impossible love and differentiated perception, I invite you to subscribe to continue exploring the deeper psychology of human connection. And please share this with someone who needs to know that their capacity to see deeply and love impossibly isn't evidence of something wrong with them, but evidence of consciousness operating at levels most people haven't developed yet. Thank you for trusting me with your time and for having the courage to look honestly at experiences that many prefer to avoid. Your willingness to explore these depths makes you part of what Jung believed was humanity's evolution toward more conscious, authentic, and transcendent ways of loving and being. Your impossible love was never your mistake. It was your awakening,